All right, welcome to our lecture on why consumer services tend to be located in a regular pattern. The slides were designed to accompany the textbook, The Cultural Landscape, and I am, of course, Ms. Gall, and I'll be your host for the lecture. So, when we talk about consumer services, first of all, you got to know a big piece of what we're talking about are cities. Okay, so really what we're looking for is we're trying to figure out how we can use the location of services as a way of gauging where we would find settlements of various sizes. To do that, the most prominent theory to do that is the central place theory, which is proposed by a guy named Walter Christaller in about the 1930s. And what you need to know is that when we're talking about characteristics of this, is that a central place has a market area. Okay, a market area just means an area that it serves. Another word for this market area is a hinterland. Okay, so it's an area outside of the actual market itself that it serves. When we talk about, to figure out kind of the size of the market area, a few characteristics that we need to keep in mind. One is the range of the service, and range is what, how far people will travel in order to take advantage of a given service or to go to a specific store. Okay. And then the second characteristic is threshold. And threshold is the number of people that a given retailer or given service provider needs in order to be able to make a profit. So when we look at those two things, what we're going to see is that range will vary depending on the service, right? And it can get fairly specific. For instance, we live in the Seattle area, right? So if I fall down and I get a scrape on my knee that's pretty bad, I might go to the nearest urgent care, right? I live in Des Moines, so there's not really an urgent care here, so I'm probably going to either Kent or to Kent, Federal Way, or Burien. Okay, I'm not willing to travel very far. Now, if on the other hand I'm on I-5 and I'm in a massive car accident and I have some very serious traumatic injuries, I'm willing to travel, or rather to have myself travel, really, since I wouldn't be doing the driving, much further to get the care that I need to take care of those injuries. So I would go into the nearest trauma hospital, probably, which is Harborview up in Seattle. Okay. And then thresholds vary as well. If I've got a small mom and pop bookstore that I run myself, and so my labor costs are pretty minimal, my threshold for customers is going to be a lot less in terms of profitability than if I am, say, a place like Walmart, where I have a huge number of employees and a huge reputation at stake. So my threshold for Walmart is going to be much, much higher. So when Christaller was forming central place theory, really what he was looking at is that you don't want overlapping market areas for the same service, like we've got in our circle diagram here on the left, but by the same token, you need to have some flexibility in terms of how far people are willing to travel, which our square diagram doesn't really give us. So what he ended up with in terms of shapes for his perfect world scenario is ultimately a combination of those two shapes, and we use hexagons. And then at the center of each hexagon is the market, or is the service provider. Okay, so just to give you an example here, we talk about, for instance, Kroger supermarkets, and the map here is of Dayton, Ohio. The red lines mark the market area for the supermarkets, and what you'll see is that while they're not obviously perfect hexagons, the threshold and the range for each is reasonably similar. Not perfectly so, but reasonably so. Or I should say the range is reasonably similar, right? Without population numbers, we wouldn't know what the threshold number is. And you can see how people will travel from outside of the city to get into the city in order to access a supermarket, if that's ultimately the nearest or the easiest to get to. Okay, so when we talk about figuring out exactly where we're going to put a given service provider, right, we got to do some market area analysis, and now we're getting into some economics along with the geography, right? So first of all, we got to look at what's the profitability of a given location. So we got to look at things like how far are people going to be willing to travel, or are people going to have to travel to get to our store? We also need to look at and compute and figure out how many people do we need to get in the door in order to be profitable, right? And the more people we get in, the more profit we get, the better off we are. And then we use that to kind of sketch out what we think our market area is, right? Once we've kind of got what we think the market area is, then we can start looking at what is the optimal location within that market, right? And then you get into issues of linear settlements and nonlinear settlements, and I'm not going to lie, those are not my strong suits, right? But you can really kind of drill down into this to figure out, literally, within a matter of a few blocks, where is the best location going to be for a given service? And people make a lot of money doing stuff like this. But we get back to kind of the big picture issue, right? So we were drilled pretty far down. We get to the big picture issue and we talk about kind of how do we see this on the overall landscape, right? If we were looking at, say, a regional scale, we're going to look at is that there's actually a hierarchy of services and settlements, right? And hierarchy, again, implies that there's some kind of rank size order, and some are bigger than others. And what Kristaller ultimately ends up doing is that he just with these hexagons, right? Because he draws hexagons of various sizes because people are willing to travel various distances for different types of services. And we discussed this a little bit earlier when we were talking about going to the urgent care versus going to the trauma center, right? So if, for instance, I want to buy groceries, I'm in Des Moines, which if you're not familiar with the Washington area, is about half an hour, 40 minutes outside of Seattle, just depending on traffic. I'm not going into the city to buy my groceries. That's not happening in my world. I'm going to go, to, typically I shop at the Fred Meyer's, which is about a mile from my house, right? I'm going to go as close as I can to get the deals that I want, and I'm not going to go any further. Now, if I want something that's a little more specialty, right, or if I want more variety, then I might be willing to travel a little bit further. That's when you get into, again, those different size settlements. And the bigger the settlement, the more services and the further people are going to be willing to travel to take advantage of those services. Okay? And so what we end up with really is an approximate kind of a rank size distribution of settlements. And when we talk about the rank size distribution of settlements, right, rank size rule doesn't apply everywhere in the world. It does in most, arguably most, more developed countries, does not apply as well in less developed countries. Okay? But it has to do with population numbers in settlements based on their place in the urban hierarchy. Primate cities, on the other hand, these are cities that are 2 times or more greater, really it's more than 2 times greater, than the next largest settlement. But not only that, these are cities that are so important that they literally dominate the economic, the cultural, the political life of a country. And the way I like to explain this is that these are the cities that really kind of, when you think of a country, you think of that city. So the classic example of this is Paris. Right? Paris is a great primate city. Paris is about 3 or 4 times the size of the next largest city, which, if I remember right, for France is Marseille. Not only that, when you think about politics in France, you think about what's going on in Paris. When you think about economics in France, think about what's going on in Paris, right? The farmers get mad. They blockade the roads into Paris. They don't go blockade the roads into, whatever 2-bit town happens to be near. They blockade the roads into Paris. That's where they're going to have the impact, right? You think of France and the images you picture, right? The Arch de Triomphe, the Eiffel Tower, the Louvre. These are all in or around Paris. That's what I mean when I'm talking about primate cities really kind of dominating the landscape. Okay, in the rank size rule, we have cities that are bigger, but they're not dominant in that same way. Right? So for instance, the U.S. is a great example of the rank size rule. We follow it reasonably closely. And the biggest city in the U.S. is New York. New York might, and arguably does, dominate the U.S. economically, but it certainly doesn't dominate the U.S. politically. It's got a lot of influence culturally, but it's not the only place of significant cultural influence. And it's not like when people think of the U.S., they only think of New York. Okay, so that's what I mean. That's kind of the way to draw that comparison. And you also have to think about, when we're talking about this hierarchy of services and settlements, is this idea of periodic markets, which is just another way of saying markets that kind of come and go a little bit, right? So maybe depending on the season or depending on demand and supply and things like that, right? When we draw out central place theory, what we get is this interlocking series of hexagons. And so this is what it looks like, and some of it's kind of hard to see, and it's a bit overwhelming visually, I gotta admit. But if you can kind of narrow in and focus in, and if you look at the brown dots that have the 3 stripes, those are our biggest cities, and their threshold and range is marked by yellow hexagons. Okay, so then our next largest settlements, those are the ones that are in the I was talking about the yellow hexagons, lost my train of thought there, right? And the next largest settlements are the ones that are in the brown hexagons, and then we go down size too. There's kind of a light blue hexagon, and then the darker blue hexagons. And each of those hexagons marks the range for a service. So how far people are willing to travel. And then we look at the urban hierarchy. Different way to classify cities, right, is we can talk about cities themselves, and then we can talk about towns, which are slightly smaller than cities, and then we can talk about villages and hamlets. And villages are smaller than towns, hamlets are smaller than villages. Okay, so living here, for instance, in Washington State, we had a lot of places that qualify in terms of city, town, arguably even village, which I think is a little bit of a push. I grew up in Alaska, and I gotta tell you, in Alaska there's a couple of cities, really of any size, 2, arguably 3. Okay, then we've got a reasonable number of towns, but the large majority of urban settlements in Alaska fall under that village level or that hamlet level. Okay, let me give you an example. So cities, we're talking about, there's 3 really of any size, which are Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Juneau. Okay. Towns, if you're familiar at all with your Alaska geography, places like Kenai, it's a pretty good sized town, Wasilla, Palmer, pretty good sized towns, right? And these are places that have a couple thousand people living in them. Then we get villages, right? And the villages have maybe a couple hundred people living in them, or a few hundred people living in them. And I'm drawing a blank on good examples of what I think would be a good example of a village right now. Maybe Eagle River, if you're familiar with the Anchorage area, would be an example of a village potentially, although arguably that's more on the town scale. So maybe, anyways, then you get the hamlets, and hamlets are a few dozen people, or maybe even as small as 2 or 3 people. Okay, so in our lecture, it's about time for me to wrap up. In our lecture on central place theory and why are services distributed evenly across the landscape, of course, central place theory, the big idea, we talked about the interlocking hexagons, thresholds and ranges of services and what that means. We talked a little bit about how do you compute those and how do you use those to figure out what's that optimum location for your service. So if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. Please just bring them into class, and I'll see you the next time we meet.